Every step we took towards the outpost felt like an approach to our own end, not because of the enemy, but because of something that was said to dwell there, something not human. My name is Alex Martinez, sergeant in the Army, and I never believed in ghosts until my squad was assigned to that cursed place. It's just a story, Martinez, I kept telling myself while observing the old outpost through my binoculars. But the stories circulating on the base about missing soldiers and screams in the night made my hair stand on end. The mission was simple: establish a position at the outpost, secure it for 2 weeks, and return. Easy, except for the rumors that it was haunted by the spirits of fallen soldiers. "This place gives me the creeps," said Corporal Perez right beside me as we set up our temporary camp inside the post. It was nothing more than a wooden structure worn out by time and neglect, with broken windows that seemed like empty eyes watching us. The first night was quiet, too quiet. There were no sounds from the jungle, no animals, no wind, just the oppressive silence and the feeling of being watched. "Did you hear that?" murmured Gonzalez, our radio operator, one night while we gathered for dinner. We all shook our heads, though the truth was we all felt something strange in the air. The real nightmare began on the third night. Blood-curdling screams broke the silence, jolting us out of our sleeping bags. Armed, we prepared for what we believed was an enemy attack, but there was no one outside, just darkness and the echo of the screams that seemed to come from all directions. The following days became torment. Apparitions of bloodied soldiers appeared and vanished in the shadows. Whispers followed us, and objects moved on their own. Gonzalez started talking in his sleep, murmuring names of people we had never met, and Perez swore he saw shadows moving at the edge of his vision. We tried to communicate with the base for an evacuation, but the radio only emitted static or occasionally distant screams. "We can't stay here," Perez exclaimed one morning after finding his backpack hanging from the ceiling with no explanation as to how it got there. "Just a few more days, guys," I tried to reassure them, though my own voice betrayed me. The reality was that I too felt fear taking over my sanity. One night the situation reached its breaking point. The screams and whispers intensified, and an invisible force hurled Gonzalez against the wall, knocking him unconscious. We grouped together, back to back, waiting for dawn to dispel the darkness and with it, the horrible apparitions. But then we saw it. At first, it was just a shadow among the shadows, but as it approached, its form became clearer. A soldier, or what had once been one, his uniform torn and stained with blood, with a face so pale and empty it seemed not to belong to this world. "We protect this place." His voice was a whisper, but each word cut the air like a knife. "Who are you?" I managed to ask, my voice trembling. "Guardians. Fallen. We cannot rest," it replied before fading away like mist at dawn. That morning, when the sun finally rose, marking the end of our night vigil, we knew we couldn't spend another day in that hell. We packed our gear, carried the still semi-conscious Gonzalez, and left the outpost at dawn. We never looked back, though the feeling of being watched followed us until the outpost was no more than a distant point on the horizon. Back at the base, we reported the events, though we softened the details, fearful of being taken for lunatics. We were assigned another mission in a different location, far from that jungle and its shadows. But still at night, when the world is silent, I can hear the whispers and distant screams. And I know those soldiers, those fallen guardians, still protect their outpost, trapped in an eternal loop of watchfulness and torment. Sometimes I wonder if some part of us stayed behind with them, doomed to haunt that haunted place, a constant reminder that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, waiting in the darkness. It was a moonless night when I decided to write these lines, a last effort to leave a record of the madness that consumed us. My hands tremble, not just from the cold seeping through the cracks of this forgotten place, but from the fear that still dominates me at the memory. My name is Alex Ruiz, Sergeant of the Special Forces, or at least I was before falling under the spell of the one I can only call the leader. Our encounter was fortuitous, a coincidence marked by fate or perhaps a curse. He arrived at our jungle camp, a middle-aged man with a presence that radiated authority and a captivating madness in his gaze. "Conventional war is over for us," he proclaimed in a voice that seemed to resonate with the very shadows. "Now we fight an ancient battle, a war that transcends time and space against enemies you do not comprehend." At first his words seemed those of a madman, but day by day his eloquence and charisma enveloped us in a web of fervor and fanaticism. He spoke to us of ancient rituals, of dark powers that could be ours if we proved worthy. And we believed him. How could we not? In the jungle, far from any trace of civilization, madness spreads like the worst of diseases. The leader led us to the depths of the jungle, to a place I swear did not belong to this world. The trees seemed to watch us with malevolent curiosity, and the sounds of the night were more a chorus of lamentations than the usual concert of wildlife. "Here," he announced with a smile that chilled my soul, "is where we will perform the ritual that will grant us the power to conquer not only our enemies, but also time and destiny itself." The madness of his plans became evident when he began marking the ground with symbols whose meanings were lost in the night of time. He ordered us to form a circle around the improvised altar, and there, under the mantle of darkness, the ritual began. I cannot, or perhaps do not want to, remember all the details. There were chants in a language none of us knew but somehow understood. The air filled with the smell of blood and wet earth, and the ground beneath our feet seemed to pulse with a life of its own. And then he sacrificed her. One of our own, chosen by the leader for reasons only he understood. Her death was the catalyst, the final ingredient that unleashed the chaos. What followed was a storm of shadows and whispers, figures dancing at the edge of our vision, promising power, eternity, dominance. But at a price. There is always a price. Some of us tried to stop it, break the circle, flee from the madness we had unleashed. But it was too late. The ritual had been completed. The following days were lost in a haze of blood and violence. The leader, now more demon than man, led us on a crusade against innocent villages, each massacre a ritual in itself, each life taken a tribute to the dark powers that now dominated us. I don't know how long it took before I managed to escape. The details are blurry, a mix of memories and nightmares. I fled, guided by instinct rather than reason, leaving behind the screams of my companions, now completely submerged in the leader's madness. I find myself alone, writing these words as a testimony to the madness that consumed a group of brave soldiers, transforming them into monsters worse than those we swore to fight. I don't know what will become of me now. The jungle surrounds me, a green labyrinth from which I may never escape. But if these words ever see the light of day, let them serve as a warning. There are things in this world and beyond, hungry and ancient, that should not be awakened. The leader, if he can still be called that, is still out there carrying out his bloody crusade in the name of forgotten gods. And I, the last witness to his madness, await the dawn, wondering if I will see another day, or if the shadows that now whisper my name will finally claim what remains of my soul. I never thought my military career would lead me to face horrors beyond human comprehension, not enemies with weapons, but those wrapped in legends and nightmares. My name is Sean, and this is my story, one that begins in the gloomy landscapes of Ireland, far from traditional battlefields. Our battalion was deployed on a peacekeeping mission, tasked with securing a small village in the heart of Ireland where disturbances had been reported. The locals, known for their folklore and ancient legends, greeted us with mixed looks of gratitude and fear. "It's the Banshee," some whispered as we passed. "She has returned to bring us misfortune." On a cold winter night, after a week in the village, the first wail reached us, a sound so harrowing that the air seemed to vibrate with pain and suffering. "It's just the wind," I tried to convince myself, but deep down something told me we were facing something inexplicable. The next morning, the village awoke covered in mourning. One of our men had been found dead, with no signs of violence, as if his heart had simply stopped beating. "The Banshee warned," said an old villager, avoiding my gaze. His reaction prompted me to investigate these legends, seeking a logical explanation for the recent events. Each night the wail returned, followed by the inexplicable death of another soldier. Our morale plummeted, fear consumed us, and I, as their commander, felt powerless. "How do you fight something you can't see?" I asked myself, seeing the fear in my men's eyes. The answer came from the most unexpected person. Maeve, a young villager with hair as red as the sunset and eyes full of ancient sadness. "The banshee doesn't seek war but to warn," she explained one night under the faint glow of the stars. "It is a harbinger of death, but also a plea to avoid it." That same night, armed only with my courage and the hope of finding answers, I followed the wail into the forest bordering the village. The mist hovered over the ground like a calm sea, and there, in the clearing of an ancient stone circle, I saw her, more beautiful and ethereal than any legend could describe, with tears that shone like diamonds under the moonlight. "Why?" was all I could ask, my voice trembling, breaking the silence between us. "Death hovers over this place," she replied with a voice that was both a lament and a melody. "But not all must follow me to the other side." Her words were a riddle that I carried back to the village where a decision awaited me. With each step I took, the pieces began to fit, revealing a truth that had been ignored for too long. The conflict that had brought us to that remote corner of Ireland was foreign to its people, an imposition by those who neither understood nor respected the ancient customs and legends of the land. The banshee, far from being a harbinger of death, was a reminder of life and what we were risking with our presence. The next day I decided to relocate our battalion, moving away from the village and the lands the banshee protected. A decision received with relief by my men and with tears of gratitude from the villagers. The night before our departure, the wail returned, but this time it had changed. It was no longer a lament of pain, but a farewell, a thank you for having listened and acted. Since that night, I have never heard the banshee's wail again, but her message stayed with me. I learned that in war, not all enemies carry weapons, and sometimes true courage lies in listening and being willing to change our course to protect what we do not understand. This experience changed me, not only as a soldier but as a human being. The Banshee of Ireland, with her chilling wails, taught me that behind every legend, there is a truth waiting to be discovered and respected. In the years that followed, I told this story as a reminder that even in the darkest times, there is room for compassion and understanding. Thus my tale concludes not with the end of a battle, but with the beginning of a deeper understanding, one that transcends the boundary between the known and the unknown, between life and death, between the soldier and the banshee. I always thought that my obsession with order and meticulousness would lead me to great discoveries in my career as a military archivist. However, I never imagined it would drive me to the brink of madness. Years ago, I was assigned the task of digitizing and cataloging military archives from the Cold War era. A monotonous job for many, but for me it was a treasure trove of secrets waiting to be unearthed. It was during this meticulous process that I found something I should never have discovered. There was an old, dust-covered folder hidden at the bottom of a mislabeled box. Its appearance indicated that it had been forgotten, or perhaps intentionally ignored for decades. Curiosity consumed me, so without hesitation, I began examining its contents. Inside were documents detailing a secret military experiment codenamed Operation Eternal Shadow. According to the reports, the objective was to explore extreme psychological warfare methods to control or even dismantle an enemy soldier's psyche. What I read next still resonates in my mind like a torturous echo. With each page I turned, each report I read, I felt my own sanity slipping through my fingers. The experiments described were inhumane, crossing ethical and moral lines I didn't know existed. One night, while working alone in the archive, something happened that changed my perception of reality. I was reviewing the notes of a scientist involved in the operation when the lights began to flicker, and an inexplicable cold filled the room. It was then that I heard a voice whispering my name from the shadows. "Who's there?" I asked, my voice trembling, revealing the fear I tried to hide. "The truth hurts, doesn't it?" replied the voice, its tone mocking, almost enjoying my terror. "I don't understand. What do you want from me?" I said, trying to locate the source of the voice in the dim light. "Freedom," was all it said before silence reclaimed the room. Days after the incident, I couldn't sleep or concentrate. Shadows seemed to move, and whispers followed me everywhere. My colleagues began to notice my erratic behavior, but how could I explain that the contents of an archive were driving me mad? Obsessed with finding answers, I delved deeper into Operation Eternal Shadow. I discovered that the experiment had been abruptly canceled, but there were no records of what happened to the test subjects or the scientific team. One night I decided to return to the depot where I found the archive. My mind told me it was madness, but something drove me to seek answers there. With a flashlight in hand, I searched every inch of the place until something caught my attention. On the ground, almost hidden among the dirt and debris, I found a diary. It belonged to the project's lead scientist. His last entries revealed the terrible truth. The test subjects had begun to manifest a collective psychic connection, a shadow of consciousness consuming everything in its path. The experiment hadn't been canceled. It had gotten out of control. With the diary in my hands, I knew what I had to do. The documents of Operation Eternal Shadow couldn't fall into the wrong hands. That night, I burned everything. The reports, the notes, even the diary. The flames consumed the words, but they couldn't erase the shadows that had invaded my mind. Now, years later, I still struggle with the aftermath of what I discovered. Sometimes in the stillness of the night, I still hear whispers from the shadows. I wonder if I will ever be free from the darkness of Operation Eternal Shadow, or if, like its test subjects, I am doomed to be consumed by it. I never imagined that what began as a series of disturbing dreams would become the most terrifying episode of my life. My name is Lucas, and until recently I served on a military base located in a remote mountainous valley. What I'm about to recount is the chronicle of how the boundary between dream and reality vanished, plunging us into a living nightmare. It all began on a cold winter night. The base, usually a hive of activity, was enveloped in sepulchral silence after curfew. That night, like my comrades, I retired early to my bunk, hoping to find escape in sleep from the tedium and rigidity of military life. But rest never came. Instead, I found myself wandering through a desolate landscape in the dream, an endless plain bathed in the dim light of a sun without warmth. In the distance, a shadowy figure stalked me, always present but never close enough to discern its features. I awoke drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. The dream was so vivid that it took several minutes to convince myself it was just a nightmare. The next morning, the mess hall buzzed with unusual murmurs. My comrades shared stories eerily similar to my nocturnal experience. We all spoke of the same desolate plain and the same shadowy figure. At first, we took it as a macabre coincidence, perhaps a product of stress or some shared routine. However, we could not ignore the growing sensation that something was terribly wrong. In the nights that followed, the nightmare repeated itself with increasing intensity. The shadowy figure began to draw closer, its features still obscured by shadows, but its presence became more threatening. What had been a distant watch now turned into a hunt. Each night, the distance between us diminished, and with it, the barrier between dream and wakefulness began to erode. The first signs that the nightmare was seeping into our reality were subtle, shadows moving inexplicably, barely perceptible whispers in deserted hallways, and an omnipresent feeling of being watched. But then the effects became impossible to ignore. One morning we awoke to find the desolate plain from our dreams physically manifested in the heart of the base. Where there once was a training field, now stretched a vast expanse of barren land under a perpetually gray sky. The shadowy figure once confined to our dreams began to appear among the building's shadows, elusive and always evading direct sight but undeniably real. Fear gripped the base. Routines were abandoned as we tried to understand the nature of what was stalking us. The figure, which we now called the Stalker, seemed to relish our terror, appearing ever closer, its presence accompanied by an unnatural cold and the echo of incomprehensible whispers. We tried to evacuate, but soon discovered the base was completely isolated, surrounded by the desolate plain stretching to the horizon in all directions. There were no signals, communication with the outside was cut off, and vehicles attempting to cross the plain never returned. The night the Stalker finally fully revealed itself is etched in my memory with terrifying clarity. We found it at the base's center, under the faint glow of emergency lights, a dark silhouette taller than any man with eyes glowing with an infernal red light. It did not speak, but its message was clear. We were prey in its domain, a hunting ground it had created for us from the depths of our own minds. The ensuing struggle was desperate and chaotic. Armed only with what we could gather, we faced the stalker in a battle we knew we couldn't win. But in that confrontation, we discovered its only weakness: light. Under the intense glare of improvised floodlights, its form became erratic, less solid, until it finally dissipated like smoke blown by the wind. At dawn, the desolate plain had vanished, as had the stalker. The base, though intact, bore the scars of our battle, a permanent reminder of the night reality bent under the weight of our shared nightmares. In the days that followed, research teams arrived, drawn by our sudden reappearance. They listened to our stories with skepticism, attributing our experience to mass intoxication or a psychotic outbreak. But we know the truth. We lived on the edge where dreams meet reality, and though the stalker had been defeated, the fear remains latent in the darkness of our minds, waiting to be awakened again. Since then, I have left military service, trying to rebuild a normal life. But the nights are long, and I fear the moment when, on the blurry edge between sleep and wakefulness, the desolate landscape begins to materialize once more and the shadowy figure stalks me from the darkness. Because I know deep within me the dream phenomenon still waits, patient, to claim its next prey. I never imagined that a simple melody could unearth the ghosts we thought buried under the rigidity of our uniform and military discipline. I always thought music had the power to calm souls, not torment them. But what we found in that old abandoned military base since the end of World War II defied all logic. It was a cloudy autumn day when my unit was assigned to inspect and secure the perimeter of what was once a bustling barracks, now consumed by vegetation and years of neglect. The mission was routine until Soldier Marquez, tasked with exploring the basements, found something peculiar: an old rusted metal box trapped among debris and old military documents. Inside, a series of audio tapes that, judging by their state, had miraculously survived the passage of time. Curiosity overcame our caution, and we decided to listen to them, ignoring the implicit warnings of their antiquity. What emanated from those speakers was not the expected sound broken by the years, but a clear, haunting, unfinished symphony performed by a forgotten military band. From the moment the first notes vibrated in the air, something in us changed. The music had a hypnotic, almost mystical quality that captivated us irreparably. Day after day, the melancholy of that symphony became our soundtrack, repeating over and over, amplifying anxieties and bringing to light repressed memories. The first signs of paranoia didn't take long to manifest. Shadows seemed to move with their own will, whispers slipped into conversations, and the unit's cohesion began to fracture. Soldier Ruiz confessed one night under the influence of the incessant music to having seen dancing figures at the edge of the forest surrounding the base, an impossible vision given the desolation of the place. We tried to get rid of the tapes, but every attempt ended in failure. The tapes reappeared, as if chained to us or we to them. The music became omnipresent, weaving its way even into our dreams, leaving a trail of insomnia and despair. It was then that I decided to investigate the origin of that symphony and its composer. My inquiries led me to discover the tragic story of a young commander, a musical prodigy who had led the band in its final days. According to the records, the symphony was his masterpiece, a piece created at the dawn of the war, intended to be the swan song of his band before they were all sent to the front. The symphony, titled The Echo of the Forgotten, was meant to be a tribute to those who would fall on the battlefield, an epic farewell that never got to be completed. The war claimed the young commander's life and his band before they could present their work to the world. Understanding the context of the symphony only deepened the mystery and fascination we felt for it. The military base had become our battlefield, fighting an enemy we couldn't see or fully understand. Tensions reached their peak one night when the music abruptly stopped in the middle of a note, leaving us in a silence so dense it could be cut with a knife. It was in that silence that we heard the sound of approaching footsteps, a distant echo of a military march that did not belong to our time. Armed and terrified, we prepared to face whatever was coming toward us, but all we found was emptiness and the echo of our own fears resonating in the base's walls. With the dawn, the symphony began to play again, but something in it had changed. The music no longer tormented us. Instead, we felt a kind of acceptance, as if we had reconciled with the ghosts of the past it evoked. We decided to leave the base, taking the box of tapes with us as a reminder of our experience. The unfinished symphony of the commander and his band had taught us an invaluable lesson about the power of memory and the weight of history. Music, they say, has the power to transcend time, to connect the past with the present. In our case, it was a bridge to the forgotten souls of those who gave their lives on the field of honor, a lesson in humanity found in the depths of our own despair. And though the symphony never found its end, we found ours, forever marked by the melody of the echo of the forgotten, a symphony that, though unfinished, had concluded its quest to be heard. I have always believed in the inexplicable, in those mysteries that hide in the folds of time and space, waiting for the right moment to manifest. However, I never imagined that my career as a military photographer would lead me to witness such anomalies, let alone question reality as we know it. It all began on a peaceful afternoon, almost at the end of my commission at a remote military base surrounded by dense jungles that concealed more secrets than any of us were willing to admit. That day I had decided to develop one last set of photographs taken during a recent patrol. The images, I hoped, would capture the essence of our daily life within those concrete and barbed wire walls: camaraderie, boredom, latent tension. What I found, however, transcended my understanding of reality. At first, the photographs seemed normal: soldiers laughing, playing cards, patrolling the dense jungle perimeters. But upon closer examination, my blood ran cold. In the background of each image, almost hidden by the gloom or disguised among the trees, were spectral figures. They were not mere shadows or tricks of the light. They were defined contours, silhouettes of what could only be described as people, or what had once been people. Convinced it was a development error, I repeated the process. The result was identical. Terrified and fascinated in equal measure, I decided to keep the photographs and ponder my next step. That night, sleep eluded me. The images of the spectral figures haunted me. Their empty eyes seemed to pierce mine, pleading, accusing. The next morning, with the first light of dawn coloring the sky gray, I mustered the courage to share my discovery with my friend and comrade, Sergeant Alvarez. "You have to see this, Alvarez." "I don't know what to think," I said, handing him the photographs. Alvarez examined them meticulously, his brow furrowing as his gaze moved from one image to another. When he finished, he handed the photographs back to me with a grave expression. "This doesn't make sense. How is this possible?" His voice denoted a mix of disbelief and concern. "I don't know, but this can't be normal. Do you think we should inform the commander?" Alvarez nodded, aware that the situation was beyond our comprehension. Together we headed to the commander's office, our boots echoing ominously in the silent hallways of the base. The commander listened attentively, examining each photograph with a look that denoted more curiosity than surprise. "Are you sure these photographs haven't been tampered with in any other way, soldier?" "Positive, sir. I developed them myself." This is concerning. We will keep this confidential for now. Continue with your duties and don't mention this to anyone else." We left his office with more questions than answers. Unease settled in my stomach, a knot that didn't loosen all day. The following days passed with palpable tension in the air. Although routines were maintained, the discovery of the figures in the photographs had added a disturbing element to our already complicated existence. Soldiers murmured about bad omens, and some claimed to have seen fleeting shadows among the trees during their night watches. It was then that I decided to conduct an investigation on my own. Armed with my camera, I began exploring the base's surroundings during the day, capturing everything my lens could encompass. Each night I developed the photographs, hoping to find a clue, some hint that would help me understand what those figures were and what they wanted from us. One night, while examining the latest revealed images, I found something that chilled my blood even more than the first discovery. Among the jungle's shadows, I captured what seemed to be a solitary figure standing and watching me. But it wasn't one of the spectral silhouettes. This figure was different, more defined, and most terrifyingly, it held something in its hand that looked like an old camera. Startled, I looked up towards the window, and for a moment I thought I saw a shadow fading into the darkness. I ran outside, adrenaline fueling my movements, but there was nothing, just the night and its unfathomable secrets. In the following days, the atmosphere at the base grew even more oppressive. Encounters with the shadows became more frequent, and some soldiers began to show signs of deep psychological strain. The commander, concerned for the troops' morale, ordered a temporary restriction on night patrols and increased psychological support sessions. However, the spectral figures were not the only mystery lurking in the shadows. The figure with the camera, that entity watching me from the darkness, became a personal obsession. Night after night, I ventured out of the base, camera in hand, hoping to capture it again, to confront it. One night, my persistence paid off. There it was, at the edge of the jungle, the solitary figure staring directly at me. Without thinking, I raised my camera and fired a burst of photos. The figure didn't move, simply stood there as if waiting for me. With my heart pounding in my chest, I approached slowly. The figure began to retreat, leading me into the jungle. I followed, each step resonating in my head like a war drum. Finally, the figure stopped in a clearing illuminated by the moonlight. There, before me, it revealed itself not as a ghost, but as an old man dressed in military clothes worn by time. His face, lined with wrinkles and scars, bore an expression of deep sadness. "Who are you?" I managed to ask, my voice trembling. "A witness," he replied in a broken voice. "A witness to the horrors these trees have seen, to the souls still wandering in search of redemption. The photographs are a bridge, a way to remember and warn." "Warn? Warn of what?" "That some sins are not washed away with time, that the darkness we harbor within can manifest in ways we never imagined." The conversation continued, and the man told me stories of forgotten battles, of secrets buried beneath the ground we trod. He spoke of how his camera had captured not just images but essences, souls trapped in an endless cycle of pain and remorse. At dawn, the man simply disappeared, leaving me alone with my thoughts and a camera full of photographs I now saw in a new light. I returned to the base transformed, with a self-imposed mission to share these stories, to ensure the souls captured in my photographs finally found peace. The days at the base passed, and eventually my commission came to an end. I left with more questions than answers, but with an unshakable conviction that there were truths in this world that could only be revealed through the lens of a camera. And so my tale ends, a story of shadows and lights, of lost souls and hidden truths. A story that has taught me that sometimes what we capture in a photograph can be much deeper and darker than we ever imagined. I look at my trembling, scarred hands. I never thought my mission in the jungle would end this way. It's a story few will believe, but I need to tell it. It all began a few months ago. Our platoon received orders to infiltrate a dense region of the Amazon jungle. We had heard rumors of suspicious activities, disappearances, strange lights at night, and whispers of a cult no one could confirm. Our team consisted of veterans hardened by years of service. I had seen my share of horrors in combat, but what we found there was different. We were deployed by helicopter at dusk. The heat and humidity enveloped us immediately, and the sounds of the jungle surrounded us, creating an unsettling symphony. Sergeant Diaz, our leader, gave us the instructions. "We need to move quickly and silently. Stay alert and don't stray from the group," he said, his voice firm, but his eyes showed an unease he rarely displayed. We began to advance, making our way through the thick vegetation. Sweat dripped down our foreheads, and the oppressive atmosphere started to play with our minds. After several hours of marching, we found the first signs that we were not alone. "Look at this," said Hernandez, pointing to a tree marked with strange, dark symbols carved with precision that didn't seem human. They were symbols none of us had seen before. We looked at each other, a feeling of unease growing within the group. However, we continued, trusting that our training would get us out of any situation. The first night was unsettling. We set up camp in a clearing and established rotating watches. But in the middle of the night, we were awakened by muffled screams and the sound of a struggle. We got up quickly, weapons ready, but it was already too late. Ramirez had disappeared, and we only found his rifle and a trail of blood leading deeper into the jungle. "What the hell happened here?" exclaimed Diaz, his face pale. No one had an answer. We decided to follow the blood trail at dawn, hoping to find Ramirez alive. The tension was palpable as we advanced. The trail led us to a dark, deep cave, its entrance hidden by vegetation. We entered cautiously, lighting the way with our flashlights. What we found inside chilled our blood. The cave opened into a wide chamber filled with symbols and rudimentary altars. In the center, a circle of candles surrounded Ramirez, tied up and gagged, his eyes filled with terror. We were not alone. Hooded figures dressed in dark robes surrounded us, their whispers filling the air. "Fire!" shouted Diaz, and we unleashed a barrage of bullets. Chaos took over the place. The figures moved with unnatural speed, and although we managed to take down several, the rest vanished into the cave's darkness. We freed Ramirez, who could barely speak of the experience. "They're not human. They're trying to summon something ancient," he managed to say between sobs. That night was even worse. We decided to stay in the cave, the only defense we could improvise. We set double guards, but one by one our men began to disappear. First it was Lopez, then Garcia. Each time someone disappeared, we found more symbols carved into the walls, as if the cave was alive and feeding on our fear. The dark rituals continued. We could hear the chanting in the distance, a hypnotic melody that infiltrated our dreams. We began to see things, shadows moving among the trees, glowing eyes in the dark. Diaz tried to keep us together, but the fear and despair were too strong. The last night before everything fell apart, we were ambushed. We were surrounded by dozens of those hooded figures. Our ammunition was running out, and hand-to-hand combat was inevitable. "We can't keep this up," shouted Hernandez, fighting off two of them. "We have to get out of here." Amidst the chaos, I saw Diaz fall, surrounded by those beings. His screams echoed in the cave, a sound I will never forget. Hernandez and I managed to escape through a narrow tunnel we found in the back wall. We ran without stopping, guided only by desperation. Finally, we reached a clearing, wounded and exhausted. The dawn light began to filter through the trees. We collapsed, aware that we were not safe, but without the strength to continue. Hernandez died that morning. His wounds were too severe. I buried him with the few forces I had left and continued alone, wandering through the jungle aimlessly with the constant feeling of being watched. Days later, I was rescued by a search patrol. I could barely speak, barely move. I was taken back to the base, where I told my story. No one wanted to believe me, but the marks on my body and mind were proof enough. Now here I am, trying to piece my life back together. I don't know if I will ever be able to forget what I saw in that jungle. But I know one thing. That cult is still out there, and their hunger for sacrifices will never be sated. It wasn't the first time I had seen death, but that night in the jungle changed everything I believed about reality. I look back with the clarity of hindsight, knowing I can never erase from my mind the lights that led us to madness. It was the year 2005. My unit had been sent on a reconnaissance mission in a dense jungle somewhere in remote South America. Our objective was to confirm the presence of insurgents and gather information about their movements. There were 6 of us: Lieutenant Ramirez, Sergeant Alvarez, Corporals Morales and Perez, Soldier Garcia, and myself. We had advanced without incident during the first day, but the real nightmare began the second night. The heat was suffocating, and the humidity covered us like a sticky blanket. We had set up an improvised camp, trying to rest before resuming the march at dawn. Garcia was the first to see them. It was around 2 a.m, and I was on guard duty with him. The jungle was silent, an unnatural silence that set our nerves on edge. Suddenly, Garcia touched my shoulder. "Did you see that?" he whispered, pointing towards the undergrowth. I looked in the direction he indicated, and there among the trees I saw small bluish lights dancing in the air. They seemed to float, moving from side to side as if they had a will of their own. "What the hell is that?" I murmured. "Will-o'-the-wisps," Garcia responded, his voice tense. "My grandmother used to talk about these things. She said they were spirits." At that moment, I woke up Ramirez and told him what we had seen. The lieutenant rubbed his eyes, still half asleep, but quickly got up upon seeing the lights for himself. "They could be flares or some kind of enemy signaling," he said, trying to stay rational. "We need to investigate." We set off, advancing cautiously towards the lights. The jungle seemed to close ranks around us. The usual night sounds had extinguished. Only the buzz of insects and the occasional crunch of our boots on the underbrush remained. The lights kept moving, always just out of our reach. We walked for what seemed like hours, always following those mysterious lights. Ramirez tried to establish radio contact, but all we received was static. "This doesn't make any sense," growled Alvarez. "We're going in circles." Perez, who had a good sense of direction, confirmed our worst fears. The compass spun uncontrollably, and we couldn't trust our own tracks. The lights had led us into some kind of trap. "Let's go back to the camp," ordered Ramirez. "We can't keep chasing ghosts." That's when we heard the first scream. It was Morales, who had lagged a bit to cover our rear. We turned and ran towards him, finding him on his knees, eyes wide open. "There! There!" he screamed, pointing frantically. The lights were approaching, but they were no longer just bluish dots. They took humanoid forms, distorted and empty, like figures made of smoke. They seemed to watch us with invisible eyes, their presence oppressive and chilling. "Let's get out of here," shouted Garcia, panic-stricken. We ran without a fixed course, trying to distance ourselves from those entities. The jungle became an impenetrable maze, and the darkness closed in around us. Every step seemed to take us further from any known point of reference. In the midst of our flight, Perez stumbled and fell into a pit of spikes. His cries of pain echoed in the night, and when we tried to help him, we realized the wound was deep and serious. He was losing a lot of blood. "We can't leave him here," I shouted, trying to stay calm. Ramirez and Alvarez improvised a stretcher with branches and our jackets. We moved more slowly now, and the lights kept stalking us, always at an uncomfortable distance. It was as if they fed on our fear, enjoying our suffering. The night seemed endless. With every step, the weight of despair grew stronger. Finally, when the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, we found a clearing. We stopped, exhausted, and Ramirez tried to establish radio contact once more. "This is Bravo Team, requesting immediate evacuation," he said, his voice trembling. "We have a wounded man and need urgent medical assistance." To our relief, the radio emitted a clear response. "Received, Bravo Team, sending a helicopter to your position." We collapsed on the ground, too exhausted to celebrate. Perez was unconscious, his breathing weak. We knew time was running out for him. As we waited, the lights disappeared as if they had never existed. The dawn brought a glimmer of hope, but also left questions unanswered. What were those lights? Why did they lead us through the jungle like that? When the helicopter finally arrived, we boarded with a mix of relief and distrust. As we ascended, I looked down, seeing the jungle grow smaller. But the lights were still there, hidden from sight, waiting for their next victim. After that mission, none of us were the same. Perez survived, but was scarred by the experience. Ramirez was transferred to an administrative post, and Alvarez requested discharge. Garcia and Morales simply disappeared one day, unable to live with the memories. I carry on, trying to find answers. The lights in the jungle will never leave me, and on the darkest nights I can still see them dancing in my mind, reminding me that there are things in this world we will never fully understand. A few weeks ago, I received an anonymous letter. It simply said, "The lights are returning," and now every night I see them again in my dreams, closer, more insistent. Perhaps one day I will have the courage to return to the jungle to face those will-o'-the-wisps once more. Until then, I live with the constant fear that one day those lights will come for me too. It was supposed to be a routine mission, or so we were told. But what we found in that house in the jungle never left us the same. I remember those days as if they were yesterday, and even now the whispers of what I lived there torment me. It was the year 1998, and I, Sergeant Ramirez, led a small reconnaissance platoon of the Army. We had been sent to a remote region in the Amazon jungle with orders to investigate reports of guerrilla activity. It was nothing out of the ordinary, but there was something in the air, something we couldn't identify. "Ramirez, we have an intelligence report of suspicious movements in the western sector. Prepare to leave at dawn," ordered Captain Mendoza, reviewing the map with seriousness. "Understood, Captain. Any additional details?" I responded, maintaining composure even though a knot was forming in my stomach. There was something in Mendoza's eyes I hadn't seen before. Concern. "Not much more, just be careful. Something in those reports doesn't add up," said Mendoza before turning away. The next morning, we set off early. My team consisted of hardened veterans, Corporal Torres, Soldier Hernandez, and Soldier Gomez. I trusted each of them with my life. After several hours of marching under the dense foliage, the radio crackled. Ramirez, this is Control. We detected an unidentified structure in your area. It could be an enemy outpost. Proceed with caution. Over, informed the metallic voice of the operator. Understood? Control. Proceeding with caution. Out, I responded, signaling my team to prepare. We advanced stealthily until we spotted the house. It was partially hidden by vegetation, an old, deteriorated structure covered in moss and vines. Something about the place felt off. "Ramirez, are you sure we should go in?" asked Torres, his voice barely a whisper. "We have no choice. We need to make sure there's no enemy activity here," I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. We approached cautiously, weapons ready. The door creaked as we opened it, revealing a dark, dusty interior. As we entered, the air grew heavy, laden with a rancid smell and something else. Something I couldn't identify. We explored the ground floor but found nothing out of the ordinary. However, the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. "Ramirez, I don't like this. Something is wrong here," said Hernandez, his voice trembling slightly. "I know, Hernandez. Stay calm. Let's finish checking and get out of here," I responded. We climbed the stairs, which creaked under our weight. We reached a hallway with several doors. We decided to split up to cover more ground. "Torres, Hernandez, check the rooms on the right. Gomez and I will take the ones on the left," I ordered. The first door we opened revealed an empty room, but the second— "Oh my God, Ramirez, look at this!" exclaimed Gomez, pointing his flashlight at the wall. The walls were covered in strange, disturbing symbols painted with what looked like blood. In the center of the room was an old, worn chair with stained leather straps. This is a torture chamber," said Gomez, his voice filled with horror. We gathered in the hallway, all visibly disturbed by what we had found. "We need to leave, now," said Torres, looking around nervously. "I agree. There's no reason to stay here," I responded, feeling the weight of the place on me. We started descending the stairs when we heard the first scream. It was Hernandez who had fallen behind. We ran back, but what we saw chilled our blood. Hernandez was on the floor, trembling and muttering incoherently. His eyes were wide with an indescribable terror. "Hernandez, what happened?" I asked, trying to shake him. "The shadows. They surrounded me. I couldn't breathe," he babbled before passing out. We carried him outside, but the air was no less dense. We decided to establish a perimeter and wait for reinforcements. Night fell quickly, and with it, the real nightmare began. Torres was the first to notice something strange. "Ramirez, did you see that? In the tree, a shadow," he whispered, pointing with his flashlight. "There's nothing there, Torres." "Relax," I tried to reassure him, though I was on the edge of panic myself. But then I saw it, a dark figure moving between the trees, disappearing as quickly as it appeared. "We're not alone," I said, my voice barely audible. The noises started soon after, unintelligible whispers, inexplicable creaks, and the constant hum of something we couldn't see. Torres, who was on guard duty, approached me with a terrified expression. "Ramirez, the house, the windows. There are faces in the windows," he said, his voice trembling. I lifted my flashlight and pointed it towards the house. There they were, pale, distorted faces watching us from the dark windows. They couldn't be real, but they were. "This is not possible," murmured Gomez, backing away. The night was an endless torment. We tried to stay together, but the visions and noises disoriented us. At dawn, we were exhausted and mentally shattered. "We need to get out of here," I said in a hoarse voice. "This house is not normal." But before we could move, the radio crackled again. "Ramirez, this is Control. We have reports of enemy activity in your area. Reinforcements are on the way. Hold your position," ordered the voice. "We can't stay here," insisted Torres, but we had no choice. Reinforcements arrived at noon, and I had never been so relieved to see another human being. Captain Mendoza led the group. "Ramirez, what the hell happened here?" he asked, looking at the house with distrust. "It's hard to explain, Captain. That house, there's something in it. Something that's not human," I replied, feeling the weight of my own words. Mendoza decided to go in with his team. We, shattered, waited outside. Hours passed, and it was starting to get dark again when they finally came out. Their faces reflected the same anguish we had experienced. "You're right, Ramirez. This house, there's something deeply wrong here. I'll order it to be sealed and marked as a prohibited zone," said Mendoza with gravity. We withdrew, leaving the House of Pain behind, but not its memories. Every member of my team, including myself, was affected for life by what we lived there. No matter how many classified reports I read or how many times I tried to rationalize it, the truth was simple and terrifying. Some places are marked by an evil so deep that it cannot be understood, only survived. And that house in the jungle was undoubtedly one of those places. I remember that mission as if it were yesterday, though the truth is, a decade has passed. It was 2014, and our unit was tasked with a reconnaissance operation in the Guatemalan jungle. The mission seemed simple: map an unexplored area and verify the existence of smuggling routes. But no one prepared us for what we would find in that cursed cave. We started the hike early in the morning. The sun had barely risen, and the humidity was already suffocating. The leader of our unit, Sergeant Ramirez, had warned us that the jungle could be treacherous, but we were all used to such warnings. We were a group of 5: Ramirez, Morales, Santos, Perez, and myself. The first part of the journey was uneventful, though exhausting. We walked for hours, cutting through the dense vegetation with our machetes and maintaining a tight formation. It was Morales who first mentioned the cave. "I've heard stories about this area," he said as we walked. "The locals call it the Eye of the Demon. They say no one who enters comes out alive." "Do you really believe in that stuff?" Santos responded with a nervous laugh. "They're just stories to scare tourists." Morales shrugged. "I'm just saying what I heard, but who knows? There are things in this jungle that can't be explained." We reached the cave at dusk. It was situated at the base of a cliff, its entrance resembling the open mouth of a beast. A palpable darkness emanated from its interior, and an inexplicable chill enveloped us as we approached. Sergeant Ramirez decided we would set up camp outside the cave and enter the next day with daylight. During the night, the usual sounds of the jungle seemed to silence around the cave. There were no insects, no croaking frogs, no whispering wind through the leaves, only an oppressive silence that seemed to absorb the sound. Around midnight, I was awakened by a scream. It was Perez. He had stepped away from the camp to urinate and was now standing, staring at the cave with wide eyes. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Ramirez asked, visibly irritated. "I saw something," Perez responded, his voice trembling. "Something inside the cave. It was like a shadow, but it had eyes." Sergeant Ramirez scoffed. "Just your imagination. Get back to camp." But something in Perez's expression made me doubt. We decided to take turns keeping watch. The next morning we entered the cave. The light from our flashlights barely penetrated the thick darkness, and every step echoed with a mocking tone. The cave was deeper than we had anticipated, its interior a labyrinth of tunnels. After a few hours of exploration, we found a large chamber. In the center was a stone altar covered in strange symbols. The air was heavy and smelled of decay. That's when the real horror began. Ramirez started behaving strangely. At first I thought he was joking, but his eyes had a vacant look and his voice sounded distant when he spoke. "We must stay here," he said. "It has chosen us." "What are you talking about?" I asked. "We need to get out of here." But Ramirez didn't respond. Instead, he kept staring at the altar, murmuring to himself. Morales tried to snap him out of his trance, but it was useless. Suddenly, Ramirez turned and attacked Morales with superhuman strength. We had to subdue him together, but we couldn't hold him down. His eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and a guttural scream came from his throat. "Morales, help!" I shouted as we struggled. "I can't!" Morales was paralyzed, frozen with terror. We finally managed to immobilize Ramirez, but we knew we couldn't keep him that way for long. Then Perez approached the altar, drawn as if hypnotized. "Perez, get away from there," I warned, but it was as if he couldn't hear me. Suddenly the cave filled with a blinding light. An icy wind surrounded us, and we felt a malevolent presence. Perez began to scream, his body convulsing violently. Something emerged from the altar and took hold of him. In seconds, Perez was no longer human. His skin turned gray and his eyes filled with a void of darkness. He looked at us, and in his gaze, there was no trace of the person we had known. "Run!" shouted Santos, and we ran out of the cave as fast as our legs could carry us. But the horror didn't end there. The entity that had possessed Perez came out of the cave with us. It moved with inhuman speed, hunting us down one by one. First it was Santos, his scream echoing in the jungle as the creature caught him. Then Morales, who tried to hide but failed. Finally, only Ramirez and I were left. The sergeant had regained some lucidity but was injured and knew he wouldn't make it far. He looked at me with a mix of desperation and determination. "Take this," he said, handing me his ID and a letter for his family. "Make sure they know what happened here." "You can't stay," I replied, but he shook his head. "It's the only way. I have to delay it so you have a chance to survive." With tears in my eyes, I left him behind and ran. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs couldn't carry me anymore. Finally, I found a path back to the base camp. I was found the next day by a search team. No one believed my story at first. They said I had suffered a nervous breakdown and that the others had died in an accident. But I know what I saw. I know what attacked us. Since then, I haven't returned to the jungle. I live with the scars of that mission and the knowledge that something dark and evil still resides in the eye of the demon, waiting for its next victim. Many years have passed since that mission, but the memories are still fresh in my mind as if it were yesterday. We were a group of experienced soldiers assigned to missions others couldn't handle. But what we found that time surpassed any imaginable nightmare. It was the summer of 2001. The night was cold and silent when we were deployed in a remote, mountainous region of Eastern Europe. Our objective was to investigate an old underground bunker that intelligence said had been used by a secret organization during the Cold War. It was said to store biological weapons, but no one was really sure. "Have you ever felt that something isn't right?" asked Martinez, adjusting his backpack as we entered the thick forest. "Always, buddy, but today more than ever," I replied, trying to keep the spirits high. When we reached the bunker entrance, an enormous rusted steel door greeted us with a sepulchral silence. Our footsteps echoed in the tunnel, and every sound seemed amplified in the darkness. "This place gives me the creeps," murmured Johnson, our demolitions expert, as he set the charges to open the door. "Stay focused," ordered Sergeant Green, his voice as firm as a rock. "We go in, secure the perimeter, and find anything of value. No heroics." The explosion was deafening, and the echo spread through what seemed like an endless labyrinth. We entered in formation, sweeping the dark, dusty corridors with our flashlights. It seemed no one had been there for decades. "I don't like this one bit," said Perez, our medic, frowning. "There's something in the air, a strange feeling." We kept moving, finding empty rooms and rusty equipment. But then something changed. We arrived at a large room with a steel door on the other side. Opening it, the air became denser, almost suffocating. In the center of the room was a hole, a sort of pit descending into darkness. "We have to go down," ordered the sergeant, though his voice now had a tinge of doubt. One by one, we descended the creaky metal ladder. At the bottom, the atmosphere was even more oppressive. The tunnel ahead was narrower, and the walls were covered in strange symbols like ancient carvings we didn't recognize. "What the hell is this?" asked Johnson, touching one of the symbols with his flashlight. "I don't know, but I don't like it one bit," replied the sergeant, moving cautiously. Suddenly, the tunnel opened into a vast cavern, dimly lit by an unidentifiable source. It was there we saw it for the first time, a shadow moving quickly among the rocks. "Did you see that?" asked Martinez, his eyes wide open. "Everyone alert! Something's moving there!" shouted the sergeant, aiming his weapon into the darkness. The first attack was swift. A creature, an amalgam of shadows and flesh, lunged at Johnson, bringing him to the ground. The gunfire echoed in the cavern, but our bullets seemed ineffective. Finally, the sergeant managed to bring it down, but Johnson was already gravely injured. "I need help here," shouted Perez, trying to stop the bleeding. As we tried to regroup, more of those creatures appeared. It was a desperate fight. Our flashlights were failing and ammunition was running low. Every time one of those things fell, two more took its place. Finally, we found an exit, a hidden door at the back of the cavern leading to an even deeper tunnel system. But we weren't safe. The traps were constant, hidden pits, blades in the walls, and poisonous gas in certain areas. Every step was a struggle for survival. "We have to keep going. We can't go back," said the sergeant. his voice hoarse from exhaustion and despair. Hours, maybe days, passed. We had no sense of time. We lost more comrades to the traps and the creatures. Finally, we reached a room that seemed to be the center of it all. In the center was a pedestal with an old, dusty book. "This must be it," I murmured, approaching cautiously. The book contained pages written in a language we didn't recognize, but the images were clear: dark rituals, human sacrifices, and an invocation to beings from another dimension. It was evident that someone long ago had tried to open a door that should never have been opened. "Let's destroy it," said Perez, with a determination in his eyes I had never seen before. We placed explosives around the pedestal and prepared to retreat. But before we could escape, one last creature lunged at us, larger and fiercer than the previous ones. It was a desperate fight. "Run!" shouted the sergeant as he and Johnson tried to hold off the creature. I ran, hearing the screams and gunfire behind me. Reaching a safe distance, the explosion shook the tunnel, collapsing everything around me. When the dust settled, I was alone, the exit blocked. I found another tunnel, and after hours of walking, I reached the surface. The morning sun blinded me, and I fell to my knees, grateful to be alive. But I knew I would never be the same. There were things in that bunker no one should know, dark secrets that should never be revealed. To this day, the memories haunt me. I see shadows in every corner, hear whispers in the darkness, and I know deep in my soul that those left behind do not rest in peace. To think that my once steady and secure hands would tremble at the memory of gunfire and the sound of desperate screams. My name is Alejandro, and I was a soldier in a conflict that history may forget, but whose scars still mark my skin and soul. This illness is not just a metaphor in history books or the speeches of old generals. It is a real, penetrating, and voracious disease that consumes from within. It starts with a tremor in the hands, a stirring in the chest, an urgency in the mind. Then it takes over you completely, dominating every thought, every action, every beat of your heart. My story began in the quiet city of Rosario, where I grew up surrounded by the gentle murmurs of the Paraná River and the vibrant colors of blooming jacarandas. My childhood passed between games on the cobblestone streets and hot afternoons when my mother, with her floral apron, prepared empanadas that filled the house with an aroma of happiness and simplicity. But that tranquility faded the day the army arrived in the city, looking for young men willing, or rather forced, to join a cause that few understood and many feared. At just 18 years old and with a heart full of uncertainty, I was forced to leave behind my home, my family, my dreams. The training was brutal, an endless series of days and nights where the only goal was to strip us of our individuality, molding us into soldiers, into war machines. They taught us to shoot, to obey without question, to harden our hearts against compassion and remorse. And then, without warning, we found ourselves on the battlefield, a desolate terrain where the very earth seemed to scream in pain. Days blended into nights, and the cold metal of the weapon became an extension of my own body. The fever had infected me, and every shot, every scream, every fallen comrade only fueled this disease, this burning that consumed all reason, all fear, all humanity. But amidst that madness there was a moment of clarity, and the fog of war lifted before my eyes. It was during a reconnaissance mission under the threatening darkness of the night when I saw an enemy, a young man not much older than me, with eyes full of fear and desperation. In that instant our gazes crossed, and something inside me broke. It was like looking in a mirror, seeing reflected not only his face but also my own fear, my own uncertainty. In an impulsive act I lowered my weapon, and with a silent gesture urged him to flee. I don't know if it was bravery or madness, but at that moment I chose to see the man before the enemy. I returned to camp that night with a storm of emotions inside me. I didn't speak of what had happened, but I knew something in me had changed irrevocably. The fever still burned, but now it was mixed with doubts and questions that dared not be voiced aloud. The following weeks were a whirlwind of combat and tactical movements. I saw friends fall, boys from my neighborhood with dreams and hopes that would never be fulfilled. Each night when I closed my eyes, the faces of those young men haunted me, and the fever turned into remorse and pain. Then came the news that we would be sent on a major assault, a mission that was promised to be decisive. The night before leaving, while everyone was preparing, I escaped. I could not bear it anymore. I could not be part of that death machine for another second. I wandered aimlessly, moving as far away as I could from the battlefield until dawn found me exhausted and lost. I took refuge in a small, abandoned village where only the echoes of the clashes could be heard. It was there that she found me, Maria, a young woman from the village who had decided to stay to care for her sick grandmother. At first, she looked at me with distrust and fear, but something in her gaze told me she saw beyond the uniform, beyond the soldier. But in the end, they gave me refuge despite the danger it represented. With them, I found a piece of humanity I thought lost. In the weeks that followed, I helped in whatever way I could, momentarily forgetting the war, the fever that still burned inside me. But war has a way of catching up with you no matter how far you run. One afternoon, while collecting provisions in the forest, I heard the sound of engines and voices. It was an enemy patrol, and I knew I had to return and warn the girls who had helped me. I ran like never before, driven by a fear and determination I did not know I possessed. When I arrived, I explained the situation and urged them to flee. Maria, with tears in her eyes, refused to leave her grandmother, who was too weak to move. In that moment, I knew what I had to do. I stayed with them, promising to protect them with my life if necessary. The patrol arrived shortly after, and what followed was a whirlwind of screams, gunfire, and chaos. The confrontation was brief but intense. I managed to neutralize the patrol, but not without consequences. A bullet grazed my shoulder, leaving a burning trail of pain. For the moment, the girls were safe, but I knew more soldiers would come. We had to move. With Maria's help, I managed to bandage my wound. The grandmother, with a look full of gratitude and sadness, urged us to leave without her. But Maria refused. She would not leave her grandmother behind. We decided to hide in the basement of the house, hoping the patrol would pass by. Those moments in the basement were eternal. The sound of boots above, the voices searching, the fear of being discovered. Maria clung to my hand. Her grip was both of fear and comfort. In her eyes, I saw reflected all the horrors and losses that war brings. When the sound of boots receded, we waited for hours before daring to come out. The house was silent, a silence heavier than the roar of battle. We decided to leave at dawn, carrying the grandmother on an improvised stretcher. Our journey was slow and dangerous, avoiding patrols and seeking refuge wherever we could. In the days that followed, my relationship with Maria grew stronger. In her, I found a bravery and determination that inspired me. In her stories, in her laughter, I saw glimpses of the life I had left behind, a life that now seemed like a distant dream. But war always has the last word. One night, while we were resting in an abandoned barn, we were surprised by an enemy patrol. We had no time to react. They captured me, leaving Maria and her grandmother behind, promising not to harm them if they cooperated. They took me back to the front, where I was judged for desertion. The sentence was predictable. I would be executed at dawn. I spent the night in a dark cell, thinking of Maria, her grandmother, my family, everything the war had taken from me. Dawn came with a cold and ruthless light. They took me to the execution site where a firing squad awaited. I closed my eyes, preparing for the end. But the shot never came. Instead, I heard screams and confusion. I opened my eyes to see a group of rebel soldiers attacking my captors. In the confusion, I managed to escape, running without looking back, driven by fear and hope. My escape took me back through a war-torn landscape. In my mind, there was only one goal: to find the girls, to ensure they were safe. The pain from my wound was a stark reminder of my reality, but also kept me focused, kept me moving. After days of relentless searching, I arrived at the place where I had left them. My heart sank when I found the barn burned to the ground. Fearing the worst, I frantically searched through the rubble until, miraculously, I found a note hidden under a stone. It was from Maria, saying they had managed to escape and were heading to a nearby village known for helping war refugees. With renewed hope, I headed for that village. The journey was long and dangerous, but the possibility of reuniting with them gave me strength. Upon arrival, after hours of searching, I found them. Maria and her grandmother were alive, though exhausted and scared. The reunion was a moment of pure joy, a brief respite amid the chaos. We decided to stay in the village, which had become a refuge for those fleeing the war. There, among others who shared similar stories, we found a semblance of peace. The three of us worked together to help others, to rebuild something of what the war had taken from us. But even in that relative peace, the war remained present. I spent sleepless nights tormented by memories, by the guilt of those I couldn't save, by the anger towards those who had caused so much pain. In time, the war came to an end. Treaties were signed, weapons silenced, but for many of us, the internal battle continued. We decided to leave the country, seeking a new beginning in a place far from the memories and scars of the conflict. We found a small town in a distant country where jacarandas bloomed with the same beauty as my childhood. There we began a new life, a life marked by war, but also by hope and love. Looking back, I realized the fever never really left me. It still burns in some corner of my being, a reminder of what I lived through, what I lost, what I survived. But it also taught me the value of life, the power of forgiveness, and the strength of human love. I am Alejandro, and this is my story, one among many about the fever of war. Here I am, looking at the vast night sky full of stars that seem to witness my deepest thoughts. My name is Martin Gomez, Sergeant of the Argentine Army, and this is my story. It was a cold night. I don't remember exactly when, between March and June, when it all began. I was stationed at a remote barracks in Patagonia, a place where many ancient legends are heard, and the landscapes leave you with a feeling that something evil is lurking. But that night, my breath was taken away for a very different reason. "Martin, do you have a moment?" said Captain Rodriguez, pulling me out of my thoughts. He was a middle-aged man with a commanding presence and a posture that spoke of years in service. "Of course, sir," I replied, following him to his office. Once inside, he closed the door, and his expression turned serious. "What I'm about to tell you must not leave these four walls," he began, and I knew immediately that this was no ordinary conversation. I nodded, feeling a knot in my stomach. "We have received confidential information. There are rumors of a covert operation involving not only the Army but also high-profile civilians. I need you to be part of a special team to investigate this." My eyes widened. "A covert operation, sir? Of what kind?" "We don't know yet, and that's your mission. To find out what's going on, who's involved, and what their objectives are." Although my mind was flooded with questions, how could I, a simple sergeant, unravel a mystery of such magnitude? "You'll start tomorrow. You'll be transferred to Buenos Aires under a false identity. There, Agent Mendoza will contact you and guide you in the next steps." I left the captain's office with a weight on my shoulders. I didn't know that conversation would change my life forever. The next day, with a backpack over my shoulder and a plane ticket in hand, I found myself at Buenos Aires Airport. The city, with its vibrant energy and noisy streets, was a world completely different from the quiet and orderly barracks I was used to. I followed the instructions to the letter, arriving at a small apartment in the Palermo neighborhood that would serve as my base of operations. That night, while the city's hustle and bustle resonated outside, my phone rang. "Gomez?" a deep and direct voice asked from the other side. "I'm Mendoza. We'll meet tomorrow at 8 at La Poesia Cafe. Don't be late." I hung up, feeling a mix of nervousness and anticipation. Who was this agent Mendoza, and what did he know about the covert operation? The next day, I entered the cafe, a cozy place full of bookshelves and wooden tables. A man in his 40s with dark hair and a carefully trimmed beard greeted me with a gesture. It was Mendoza, without a doubt. "Martin, sit down. Let's get straight to the point," he said, taking a sip of his coffee. "The operation we're investigating seems to be related to illegal arms trafficking. There are indications that high-ranking Army officers, as well as politicians and businessmen, are involved." My mind was spinning. Arms trafficking? Officers involved? It was more serious than I had imagined. "Your role will be to infiltrate certain military and political circles. We need to gather information, anything that can help us understand the magnitude of this operation." I nodded, although the idea of infiltrating those circles seemed almost impossible. "And how am I supposed to do that?" Mendoza smiled slightly. You have skills that others don't. You're smart, observant, and most importantly, no one knows you here. That gives you an advantage. We spent the next few hours discussing the details of the plan. Mendoza had connections at various levels of the government and the army, and had designed a false identity for me, Marcelo Fernandez, a young entrepreneur interested in defense contracts. As I left the cafe, I felt a heavy responsibility on my shoulders. Not only did I have to protect my true identity, but I also had to delve into a dangerous and unknown world. The following days were spent immersing myself in my new identity. Marcelo Fernandez was a complex character. I had to be convincing, a businessman with enough knowledge about defense and armament not to raise suspicions. Mendoza provided me with forged documents and a detailed background story. I studied every detail, every date, every fictitious event of Marcelo's life as if it were my own story. My first task was to attend a gala event where several high-ranking officers and influential politicians would gather. It would be the perfect opportunity to start establishing contacts and gathering information. On the night of the event, dressed in an elegant suit and feigned confidence, I mingled with the guests. The room was full of lively conversations, laughter, and the sound of clinking wine glasses. I approached the bar, ordering a drink while discreetly observing the crowd. "Is this your first time at one of these events?" The voice came from a woman beside me. She was tall, with brown hair and eyes that reflected intelligence and curiosity. "Yes, it is, actually. I'm Marcelo Fernandez," I replied, extending my hand. "Lucia Ramirez," she said, shaking my hand. Her grip was firm, confident. "I work at the Ministry of Defense." The conversation flowed naturally. She was insightful, and soon I found myself talking more than I had planned. However, I maintained my character's facade, sharing anecdotes and false information I had prepared. As we talked, a man approached. Lucia introduced him as Colonel Torres, a high-ranking army officer. The colonel had an imposing presence and a gaze that seemed to see right through you. "Nice to meet you, Marcelo. I've heard you're interested in the defense business," Torres said, studying me with an evaluative look. "That's right, Colonel. I believe there's a lot of potential in the sector," I responded, trying to sound as convincing as possible. Torres nodded, but his eyes continued to analyze me. I felt a hint of fear, wondering if he had seen something in me that betrayed my true identity. The night continued, and I managed to establish several useful contacts. However, the feeling of being watched by the colonel never left me. Upon returning to the apartment, I sat in the dark, reflecting on the night. I had accomplished what I came to do, but something in the colonel's gaze unsettled me. What did he really know? And what secrets lay beneath the surface of these meetings? The following days, I delved even deeper into Marcelo's world. I attended meetings, dinners, and events, always with my ears and eyes wide open, looking for any clues that might lead me to the heart of the arms trafficking operation. Lucia became a constant presence, an ally in a world of shadows and half-truths. But it was the colonel who occupied my thoughts. His inquisitive gaze and imposing presence made me question every move. One afternoon, while I was at a cafe reviewing notes and messages, my phone vibrated. It was a message from Mendoza. "Urgent meeting, Parque Rivadavia, 20 minutes. Something in the brevity of the message told me something important had happened. I arrived at the park as quickly as possible. Mendoza was sitting on a bench, disguised with a hat and sunglasses, almost unrecognizable. "Martin, we have a problem," he said without preamble. "We've received information that someone is looking into Marcelo Fernandez. Someone is not convinced of your identity." Panic gripped me. "Who is it? What do they know?" "We're not sure, but everything points to someone within Colonel Torres's circle." "Torres?" I knew there was something about his way of looking at me. "What do we do now?" I asked, trying to stay calm. "For now, continue with the mission. But be even more careful. If you discover anything, contact me immediately." I nodded, though a voice inside me screamed that I was entering even more dangerous waters. The following weeks were filled with events and meetings. I began to gather information, names, dates, places. But the feeling of being watched never disappeared. In every corner, in every shadow, I felt the eyes of the unknown person investigating Marcelo. It was at a gala dinner where it happened. I was conversing with a group of officers when I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned to find myself face to face with the colonel. "Marcello, may I have a word with you in private?" he asked, though his tone indicated it was not a question. I followed him to a secluded room where we were alone. Torres closed the door and turned to me. His expression was hard, inscrutable. "Who are you really, Marcello?" he asked directly. "I've been investigating, and there are things about you that don't add up." I felt as if the ground was disappearing beneath my feet. This was the moment I had feared. My mind raced frantically, looking for a way out, an explanation that could satisfy the colonel without revealing my true identity. But before I could articulate a response, Torres continued. "I've done my own research, Marcelo, or should I say Martin Gomez, sergeant of the Argentine army." My heart stopped. He knew who I was. The entire espionage game, my mission, seemed to crumble before my eyes. Torres approached. His gaze now was not of suspicion, but of something deeper, almost respect. "I know why you're here, Martin, and I also know you're not the only one looking for answers about the arms trafficking operation." "What do you mean?" I asked, still in shock. "That you have allies where you least expect it," said Torres. "Not all of us are happy with what's happening in the shadows of our institution." I was stunned. The Colonel Torres, an ally? "How can I trust you?" I asked, still cautious. "For now, you have no other choice," Torres said with an ironic smile. "But you need to trust me if we're going to expose this operation." I left the dinner that night with a mix of fear and hope. Torres's revelation had changed the game completely. Now, instead of being alone in this mission, I had an unexpected ally, one with power and influence. The following days, under Torres's guidance, I delved even deeper into the investigation. With his help, I began to unravel a network of corruption and betrayal that went beyond what I had imagined. High-ranking officers, politicians, and even businessmen were involved in the illegal arms trafficking. Meanwhile, Lucia and I also teamed up. She had become a confidant, someone I could trust in this world of deceptions. Together with the information we gathered, we began to build a solid case. But with every step we took towards the truth, the danger grew. We knew we were playing a dangerous game, one that could cost us everything. It was a rainy night when it all came to a head. I received an urgent message from Torres. "Meeting, Hangar 3, Old Airport, 11 p.m. It's time to act." With my heart in my throat, I headed to the place. The hangar, a large and somber building, seemed abandoned. Upon entering, I saw Torres and Lucia waiting for me. But they were not alone. Alongside them was a group of men and women, some in uniforms, others in civilian clothes. "It's time to bring the truth to light," said Torres, looking at all of us. "Tonight we dismantle the operation and expose the culprits. Are you ready?" I nodded along with the others. This was the moment of truth, the end of a long and dangerous path. But we were ready. Together, we were going to change the course of this story. The tension in the air was palpable as we prepared to take action. The hangar, with its structure worn by time, seemed to hold more secrets than we had anticipated. Torres gave us a final look, one that spoke more than 1,000 words, and we nodded. We were ready. We split into teams, each with a specific task. My team, led by Lucia, was in charge of the back of the hangar where it was suspected the weapons were stored. Opening the metal doors, we were faced with a scene that left us breathless. Not only were there boxes of weapons, which in themselves were damning evidence, but something much more grim. At the back of the hangar, chained and in deplorable conditions, was a group of people. They were hostages, some visibly injured, others immobile. Lucia and I looked at each other, the horror reflected on our faces. We quickly began assisting the hostages, freeing them from their chains. The cries of pain and whispers of gratitude mixed into a heart-wrenching chorus. Among the hostages, we found a young man who could barely speak. With a trembling voice, he told us how they had been kidnapped and used as bargaining chips in the arms trafficking. Some, he said with tears in his eyes, did not survive the brutal treatment. Meanwhile, Torres and the other teams had secured the perimeter and detained several suspects. Among them, high-ranking officers and political figures whose faces of surprise and fear revealed their guilt. The police and emergency services arrived shortly after. As the hostages were attended to and the culprits were taken into custody, I stood watching the scene. Despite the victory, the taste was bittersweet. We had uncovered a corrupt operation and saved lives, but the cost had been high. Too high. The news of the operation and the rescue of the hostages spread quickly. The arms trafficking network had been dismantled, but at an unimaginable price. The stories of the hostages, the lives lost, became a somber reminder of human cruelty and greed. In the following days, as the case unfolded in the courts and the media, I withdrew to a quiet place to reflect. I had entered this mission seeking justice, but had found much more. I found the darkness that lurks in the most unexpected corners and the light of those who fight against it. As I looked at the horizon, I knew my life would never be the same. But I also knew that despite everything, I had done the right thing, and that was something I could live with. This happened in the winter of 2010 when I was assigned to a military base in a remote and mountainous region. We were sent there to conduct training exercises and ensure all equipment was in optimal condition. We were a group of 10 soldiers led by Captain Hernandez, a strict but fair man. The base, known as the Fortress, was practically isolated from the rest of the world. The roads were treacherous and in winter became completely impassable due to snowstorms. Supplies were delivered by helicopter, but a fierce storm left us cut off for weeks. The first sign that something was wrong was the storm. It was as if nature itself had turned against us. Snow fell in astonishing amounts and the wind howled with inhuman force. Days became indistinguishable from nights, and the temperature dropped to dangerous levels. The generators began to fail, leaving us without electricity for long hours. Still, we tried to keep morale high. "Come on, guys, this won't last forever," Captain Hernandez would say. "We just need to stay calm and keep up with our tasks." But calm was hard to maintain when we were trapped in darkness with only our thoughts for company. The isolation began to affect us all in different ways. The first incident happened in the 3rd week of the storm. We were sitting in the dining hall, eating in silence, when we heard a strange noise coming from the storage rooms. It was a dry, repetitive thud that echoed through the empty hallways. "What the hell was that?" asked Garcia, one of the younger soldiers. The captain stood up immediately. "Garcia, Martinez, go check it out. The rest of you stay here." With flashlights in hand, we headed towards the source of the noise. The storage room was dark, and the air was freezing. I felt a chill run down my spine when we opened the door and found Rodriguez, one of our comrades, banging his head against the wall over and over. "Rodriguez, what are you doing?" I shouted, trying to restrain him. His eyes were glazed over as if he couldn't see us. He barely responded to our words. We finally managed to stop him and take him to the infirmary. The captain ordered us to keep him under surveillance, but that night none of us slept well. After the incident with Rodriguez, the atmosphere at the base became more tense. We all began to feel a strange presence, as if something or someone was watching us. We started hearing inexplicable noises at night. Whispers, footsteps echoing through empty hallways, and doors slamming shut for no apparent reason. "Did you hear it last night, too?" Martinez asked me one morning as we prepared for our daily tasks. I nodded, trying to stay composed. "Yes, it sounded like someone was walking through the dorms, but when I went to check, there was no one there." The captain tried to maintain order, but even he seemed affected by the situation. We started arguing more frequently, and paranoia took hold of us. The isolation, lack of sleep, and constant feeling of being watched were tearing us apart. The breaking point came when one night we found Garcia talking to himself in one of the hallways. He was muttering incoherently, and his eyes reflected indescribable terror. "They're here. They're watching us. We can't escape," he kept repeating. We tried to calm him down, but his behavior only worsened. That same night, other soldiers began showing signs of extreme paranoia. Some claimed to see shadows moving in the darkness. Others heard voices whispering in their ears. "This can't go on. We have to get out of here," Captain Hernandez said in an emergency meeting. "As soon as the storm stops, we'll request immediate evacuation." But the storm seemed endless. Desperation consumed us, and irrational acts became more common. One day we found Martinez trying to escape the base, completely disoriented and frozen from the cold. We had to drag him back, but his mind was already lost. The situation reached its peak when we discovered the truth about the base. One of the soldiers, Lopez, had found old documents in the archives. They were reports from decades ago talking about secret experiments conducted at the base. Apparently, the military had attempted to develop techniques for extreme isolation and mind control to test the limits of human endurance. "This explains a lot," said Lopez, a look of horror on his face. "We're not the first to go through this. Everyone who was here before lost their sanity." The revelation left us speechless. The base was not only physically isolated but also cursed by past atrocities. We were guinea pigs in a forgotten experiment. With morale at an all-time low and the storm showing no signs of stopping, Captain Hernandez made a drastic decision. "We can't wait any longer. We have to try to reach the evacuation point on foot. It's our only chance." We knew it was a suicide mission, but staying at the base meant a slow and torturous death. We prepared with what little we had and ventured into the snow. The march was hellish. The snow beat us relentlessly and the cold bit at our bones. Every step was a struggle, and each of us carried the weight of despair and fear. Some didn't make it. Their bodies were buried in the snow, victims of the relentless weather and their own broken minds. Those of us who survived did so barely. We were rescued by a search team sent after we lost all communication. We were malnourished, frozen, and mentally devastated. Now, years later, I still struggle with the memories of those days. The nights are the worst. The whispers and shadows still haunt me. Many of my comrades were committed to psychiatric hospitals, unable to overcome the trauma. I wonder if I'll ever truly escape the fortress, because even as time passes, some scars never heal, and the isolation and madness of that military base remain a permanent shadow in my mind. I was stationed at a facility in the middle of nowhere, in a country whose geography and climate were as hostile as the conflicts fought there. We were at a forward base in Afghanistan, surrounded by mountains and sand, always on high alert. But although external threats were constant, what truly terrified us that night came from within. It all started with a radio call. It was around 2 a.m, and most of us were half asleep or trying to fall asleep on our uncomfortable cots. The voice on the radio was from Corporal Ramirez, one of those on night watch. "Bravo 1 here, reporting a strange situation at the south perimeter. Requesting reinforcements, over." Ramirez's voice sounded tenser than usual, putting us on immediate alert. Sergeant McAllister, who was on duty in the operations center, responded quickly. "Bravo 1, this is Foxtrot. What kind of strange situation? Over." There was a pause, and then Ramirez's voice returned, more anxious. "Something's moving out there, but it doesn't seem human. It's big, very big. I need support now. Over." McAllister wasted no time. He woke some of us, including Lieutenant Johnson and me. We geared up and went out into the cold night air. The full moon illuminated the terrain, creating long, disturbing shadows. When we reached the watch post, we found Ramirez pale and sweaty, pointing into the darkness. "Over there, right on the edge of the perimeter," he said, trembling. "I saw something, but it wasn't human. It moved fast and silently." Johnson took out his night vision binoculars and scanned the area. He saw nothing. However, the feeling of unease didn't go away. We decided to patrol the perimeter, but we found nothing out of the ordinary. Returning, McAllister tried to calm Ramirez. "Probably a wild animal," he said. "There's all kinds of stuff out here, you know." Ramirez nodded, but I could see in his eyes that he wasn't convinced. The next night, things got even stranger. Around the same time, another radio call woke us up. "Foxtrot, this is Charlie 2. Something's banging on the north gate. We can't identify what it is. Requesting orders, over." Johnson and I mobilized again. When we got to the north gate, we heard the dull, constant banging, but no one was there. The guards were nervous, pointing towards the dark outside. "It sounded like someone was banging hard, but there's nothing," said Private Harris, his voice trembling. "This makes no sense." Johnson thoroughly inspected the area but found nothing. There were no tracks or signs of intrusion. We were starting to get desperate. What was happening at this base? As days passed, the events became more frequent and strange. Lights flickered on and off, communication equipment failed for no apparent reason, and inexplicable sounds were heard everywhere. We started seeing shadows moving at the edges of our vision, always too fast to be identified. One night, while on my watch, I heard a soft, whispering laugh. It came from the ammunition storage area. Investigating, I found Ramirez standing alone in the dark, murmuring to himself. "Ramirez, are you okay?" I asked, touching his shoulder. He turned slowly, and I saw in his eyes a mix of terror and confusion. "They're watching us," he whispered. "They're here with us. They've always been here." The situation reached its critical point when McAllister disappeared. One night, he simply didn't show up for his shift. We searched the entire base but found no trace of him. His gear, his weapon, everything was intact in his barracks as if he had vanished into thin air. "This isn't normal," said Johnson, his voice laden with worry. "We need to evacuate and report this to higher-ups." But before we could make that decision, something else happened. A figure appeared on the security cameras, moving among the shadows. It wasn't McAllister. It was something else, something that shouldn't exist. That night, we decided to take matters into our own hands. Armed to the teeth, we went out in search of answers. We followed the security cameras, which guided us to the source of the figure. We arrived at an old abandoned warehouse, a place rarely used. Entering, the air became dense and cold. The lights flickered, and a fetid smell filled the place. At the back, we saw a shadow moving erratically. We advanced cautiously, fingers on the triggers. "Who's there?" Johnson shouted, his voice echoing in the emptiness. The figure turned slowly. It was McAllister, but not as we remembered him. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes empty and lifeless. "Help me," he screamed in a voice that wasn't his own. "Please get me out of here." Before we could react, something dark and viscous slid towards us from the shadows. We fired our weapons, but the bullets seemed to have no effect. The thing moved with unnatural speed, dodging our attacks. We finally managed to escape the warehouse, but McAllister stayed behind, his screams echoing in our minds long after we had fled. The next morning, we evacuated the base. There were no official explanations, just orders to leave the place immediately. As we flew away in the helicopters, I looked down and saw the base disappear into the sand and mountains, taking our fears and secrets with it. We never knew what really happened at that base. The official reports classified it as inexplicable phenomena, but those of us who were there know it was something more, something that blurred the line between reality and nightmare, leaving us forever marked. Years later, I still have nightmares. In my dreams, I return to that base, walking the same hallways, hearing the same unsettling sounds. And always at the end, I see McAllister, asking for help from the other side of an impenetrable darkness. That experience changed my life and those of everyone who was there. It taught us that sometimes the worst nightmares are not the ones we face on the battlefield, but the ones we carry within, fueled by fear of the unknown and the inexplicable. It was a dark and rainy night, one of those where the humidity penetrates to the bone. I still clearly remember the echo of the storm in the military base. We were stationed in a remote location, a facility that seemed forgotten by everyone but us. We were a group of seasoned soldiers used to danger, but nothing had prepared us for what was to come. My name is Manuel, but my comrades always called me the Tiger for my ability to move stealthily in any terrain. We had received orders to secure the base against a possible external threat. What we didn't know was that the real danger was much closer than we imagined. It all started with a strange incident. Carlos, one of the most experienced soldiers, disappeared during his guard duty. Initially, we thought he had gotten lost in the storm, but when we found him the next day, his body was mutilated in a way no beast could have done. "This isn't the work of an animal," said Sergeant Rodriguez, staring intently at Carlos's lifeless body. "There's something else, something we don't understand." The atmosphere in the base became tense. Each of us became more paranoid, double-checking our weapons and ensuring we were never alone. But paranoia wasn't enough to protect us from what was coming. One night, while on guard with Joaquin, we heard a strange noise near the barracks. It was a hissing sound, almost human, but not quite. We moved cautiously, following the noise. What we found froze us in our tracks. A soldier, someone we immediately recognized as Miguel, was crouched by the warehouse door. He seemed to be handling something on the ground, but when we got closer, we saw he was placing explosives. "Miguel, what the hell are you doing?" I shouted, pointing my weapon at him. Miguel looked up, his face pale and his eyes vacant as if there was no soul behind them. "It's the only way," he whispered. "They're coming, and we can't stop them." Before we could react, Miguel activated a switch and a deafening explosion shook the base. The blast wave threw us to the ground, and when I regained consciousness, Joaquin lay motionless beside me, covered in debris. The base was in chaos. Screams and gunfire echoed in all directions. The few soldiers left tried to organize, but panic had taken over everyone. I got up as best I could, my ears still ringing from the explosion. I found Sergeant Rodriguez organizing an improvised barricade with the remaining soldiers. I approached him, trying to understand what was happening. "Sergeant, Miguel. He was placing explosives," I said, still dazed. Rodriguez looked at me with a mix of disbelief and despair. "I know, Manuel. He's not the only one. There are more traitors among us. We don't know who to trust." At that moment, I understood the magnitude of the problem. We weren't just facing an external threat. The enemy was among us, and we had no idea how many more might be conspiring against us. We decided to retreat to the communications room, the only place still relatively intact. We needed to call for reinforcements and evacuate the base before it was too late. But upon arrival, we discovered the communication systems had been sabotaged. We were completely cut off. "We need to get out of here," said Rodriguez, his voice firm despite the fear in his eyes. "Let's head to the airstrip and take one of the helicopters." We moved silently, senses alert to any sign of betrayal. Every shadow, every noise put us on the brink of collapse. When we reached the airstrip, we found the helicopters inoperable. Each one had been sabotaged. "We're trapped," said one of the soldiers, the desperation in his voice palpable. Rodriguez turned to us, his face hardened by determination. "We're going to resist. We won't surrender without a fight." We barricaded ourselves in the main building, awaiting the inevitable. Each passing hour increased the tension. We knew the traitors were among us, but we didn't know who they were or how many remained. Then one night, while on guard with Rodriguez, we heard a whisper near the entrance. We approached stealthily, and what we saw took our breath away. A group of soldiers, those we thought were friends, were talking in low voices, planning their next move. "We can't let them escape," said one of them. "We must ensure they can't call for help." Rodriguez and I looked at each other, understanding it was time to act. Without hesitation, we opened fire. Surprise was on our side, and in minutes the traitors lay on the ground. But the battle wasn't over. We knew there were more. The following days were a constant nightmare. Paranoia and fear became our constant companions. Every step we took, every shadow we saw made us wonder if it was the end. But we resisted, knowing surrender was not an option. Finally, after what seemed like weeks, reinforcements arrived. A rescue team landed at the base, finding us exhausted but alive. The betrayal had been crushed, but at a high cost. Many of my comrades didn't make it, and those who survived would never be the same. Looking back, I realized the true lesson of that experience was understanding that the real enemy isn't always outside. Sometimes the most dangerous threat comes from within, disguised as trust and camaraderie. And in those moments, true bravery is found in maintaining hope and determination, even when everything seems lost. That was the last mission I completed at that base. After that, I retired from active service, carrying with me the scars, both physical and emotional, of a night when the enemy was not who we expected, and the fight for survival revealed the true nature of betrayal. We were stationed at a military base deep in the forests of Germany. We had received reports of strange activities at an old abandoned facility. At first glance, they seemed like local superstitions, but something in our superiors' voices made us understand there was something deeper, something that needed to be investigated by professionals. May 22nd, 2019. The operation began at dusk. My team consisted of 5 men: Sergeant Miller, a veteran hardened by many battles; Corporal Johnson, always the first to enter combat; Private Novak, our communications expert; Private Hernandez, our medic; and me, Lieutenant Carter, in charge of the mission. "Listen up, guys. This may seem like nonsense, but we need to take it seriously," said Sergeant Miller as we prepared. "There have been reports of disappearances and strange sounds. We're not going to ignore these reports just because they seem like fantasies." The road to the facility was dark and winding. The forest closed in around us, and every creak and whisper seemed amplified in the night's stillness. I felt a knot in my stomach. a sensation I couldn't shake. We arrived at the facility's entrance, an old WW2-era armaments factory now in ruins. The entrance was covered in vegetation and the air smelled of damp and mold. "Johnson, open the door," I ordered. Johnson nodded, and with effort managed to open the heavy metal door, which creaked as if protesting our presence. Inside, the darkness was total. Novak turned on his helmet lights, and soon we all did the same. The beams of light revealed a long hallway covered in dust and debris. We moved in silence, our steps echoing in the emptiness. Suddenly, the sound of a dry thud made us stop. "What was that?" whispered Hernandez. "Nothing good," replied Miller, gripping his weapon tightly. "Stay alert." We continued advancing, passing empty offices and desolate warehouses. The atmosphere grew more oppressive. Finally, we reached a large room, apparently a laboratory. The tables were covered with old instruments and yellowed documents. "This seems to have been a research center," observed Novak, examining the papers. "There's something written here," said Hernandez, pointing to a document in German. "It talks about experiments with something called dark energy." "Dark energy?" I repeated, feeling a shiver. "What the hell were they doing here?" Before we could discuss more, a gust of wind swept through the room, scattering papers everywhere. The lights began to flicker, and a sensation of cold enveloped us. "What's happening?" exclaimed Johnson, pointing his weapon into the darkness. "Something's not right here," I said, trying to stay calm. "Miller, Novak, check that door. Hernandez and Johnson, cover our rear." Miller and Novak approached a door at the back of the room. It was closed with an old, rusty lock. Novak tried to force it, but it was stuck. "We need something to open this," said Novak, frustrated. "Use this," replied Johnson, tossing him a crowbar. With combined effort, they managed to open the door, revealing a descending staircase. A gust of cold air hit us, bringing with it a stench of decay. "Let's go down carefully," I ordered, and we began to descend. The steps creaked under our weight, and the echo of our steps resonated in the darkness. At the bottom, we found ourselves in a narrow, gloomy hallway. "This wasn't on the plans," murmured Hernandez. "Someone didn't want us to find this," replied Miller. We advanced cautiously until we reached a metal door. It was covered in strange symbols and had a small glass window. Through it, we could see a room illuminated by a faint blue light. "What the hell is that?" asked Johnson, trying to get a better look. "Let's find out," I said, pushing the door open. We entered the room, and what we saw left us speechless. In the center was a huge machine with tubes and cables connecting to a glass tank filled with a dark liquid. "This looks like a portal," said Novak, examining the machinery. "A portal to where?" asked Hernandez, visibly scared. "I don't know, but I don't like it," replied Miller. Suddenly, the machine came to life, emitting a low, constant hum. The glass tank began to bubble, and a dark figure started forming inside it. "Get out of here!" I shouted. But before we could react, the figure broke through the glass, materializing in front of us. It was an amorphous shadow with glowing red eyes. "Open fire!" I ordered, and we all started shooting. The bullets passed through the figure without causing any damage. The shadow advanced toward us, and one by one my men began to fall, trapped by its cold, dark claws. "Miller, Novak, Hernandez!" I shouted, but it was useless. The shadow moved with supernatural speed, and soon I was the only one left. I felt its claws wrap around me, a cold that chilled to the bone. My vision blurred and everything went black. When I woke up, I was back at the facility's entrance, alone. My men had disappeared, and the facility was in ruins, as if no one had been there for decades. I tried to communicate by radio, but only got static. Finally, I found my way back to the base, but no one believed my story. The facility was sealed off and the operation was classified. But I know what I saw. I know what happened to us that night. And since then, I haven't stopped feeling that presence, that shadow that still haunts me in my nightmares. That night, we discovered that there are things in this world that shouldn't be disturbed, things that don't belong to our plane of existence, and we paid a very high price for our curiosity. Looking back, it all seems so unreal, almost like a nightmare that refuses to fade. We were a platoon of 5 soldiers sent to a remote military base in the mountains of Afghanistan. I clearly remember the journey there, the nervous laughter, the jokes to calm the nerves, but nothing could prepare us for what awaited us. "Lieutenant, have you ever heard the stories about this base?" asked Corporal Garcia as we approached our destination. His eyes reflected a mix of curiosity and fear. "Stories, Garcia? Don't worry about nonsense. We have a mission to fulfill," I replied, trying to keep morale high. But the truth was that even I had heard strange rumors about that place. Unexplained disappearances, strange noises, and the feeling of being watched. The base itself was a gloomy place. Surrounded by dense forests and with an oppressive atmosphere, it seemed stuck in time. The walls were covered with moss and dampness, and the wind howled through the abandoned buildings. Our first day passed without incident, though we all felt a growing unease. That night, while we were eating in the dining hall, the problems began. "Did you hear that?" asked Sergeant Ramirez, his face pale as he looked toward the dark windows. We all fell silent, and then we heard it. A faint whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "It must be the wind," I said, though I didn't believe it myself. That night I had trouble sleeping. The whispers didn't stop, and in my dreams I saw shadows moving through the base's hallways. The following days were a living nightmare. The shadows and whispers became more frequent. The feeling of being watched became unbearable. One night, while on patrol, Corporal Perez disappeared without a trace. "Perez! Perez!" we shouted through the base, but there was no response. Desperation took hold of us. We split into groups to search for him, but all we found were his belongings scattered on the ground and a trail of blood that disappeared into the forest. "This doesn't make sense," said Private Martinez, his hands trembling as he held his rifle. "There's no one else here. How could he just disappear?" Things only got worse. We began to see dark figures moving at the edges of our vision. We heard footsteps when no one was around. One night, Sergeant Ramirez got up from his bed and began walking in a trance toward the forest. "Ramirez, stop!" I shouted, running after him. But it was in vain. He seemed possessed, his eyes glazed and lifeless. We found him at dawn, dead at the foot of a tree, his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. Only 3 of us remained: Garcia, Martinez, and me. Paranoia consumed us. We barely slept, and when we did, the nightmares were unbearable. It was then that Garcia began having hallucinations. "Lieutenant, they're here, they're watching us," he said one night, his eyes sunken and red. "Who, Garcia?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "The shadows. They're hunting us." That night, Garcia took his own life. We couldn't stop him in time. Despair and fear had driven him to the edge. Martinez and I knew we had to leave that place, but something held us back. It was as if an invisible force tied us to the base. The last night, Martinez disappeared from his guard post. I found him at dawn, his body hanging from one of the dining hall beams. I was the only one left. Exhausted and on the brink of madness, I decided to leave the base. As I walked through the forest, the whispers grew louder, and the shadows seemed to follow me. When I finally reached the base camp, I fell to my knees, exhausted. They immediately took me to the infirmary, where I lost consciousness. When I woke up, I found myself in a white room, surrounded by doctors and officers. "Lieutenant, can you tell us what happened out there?" asked one of the officers, his voice calm but full of concern. I told them everything: the shadows, the whispers, the disappearances. They listened in silence, and in the end they looked at me with a mix of compassion and pity. "Lieutenant, we found no evidence of what you describe. The base is in perfect condition, with no traces of blood or bodies. It all seems to be in your mind," said the doctor, his voice gentle. At first I didn't want to believe it, but as the days passed and the memories became more nebulous, I began to doubt my own sanity. Had it all been an illusion? Had I lost my mind in that cursed place? Today, 4 years later, I still have no answers. Psychologists say it was a mental collapse due to stress and tension. But every night when I close my eyes, I see those shadows moving and hear those whispers that haunt me. Was it real or just an illusion created by my mind? I'll never know for sure, but one thing is certain: that place left an indelible mark on my soul.